truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, the 1364th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'm your moderator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right. I'm assuming that everybody is back from their big, extravagant Columbus Day adventures. Maybe you traveled down to Myrtle Beach to visit the spot where Columbus discovered America, thinking for whatever reason that it might be India. Maybe you studied diphtheria and typhus, since Christopher Columbus brought those over from Europe specifically to spread diseases to minority populations. Or maybe you just found a way to honor indigenous peoples. I hope you were able to have a few moments of true reverence for everything that Columbus Day means to us in our American experience. And yeah, maybe it means something completely different than it used to. And maybe it'll mean something different later, or even the same thing again. Or maybe it'll mean nothing at all. But whatever it means to you, I hope you had the greatest Columbus Day you've ever had. I hope you had the sort of adventure that would make the world's greatest adventurer jealous. And I hope, like him, your great adventure started as a result of driving the wrong way. All right. Thank goodness that was a long weekend. I hope everybody got their racism out of the way. And now we will pick up where we left off last week. I will try to recap very briefly. On Thursday, we started out with Mike Pompeo's comments on November 10th of 2020.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. All right? We're ready. The world is watching what's taking place here. We're going to count all the votes. When the process is complete, there'll be electors selected. There's a process. The Constitution lays it out pretty clearly. The world should have every confidence that the transition necessary to make sure that the State Department is functional today, successful today, and successful with the president who's in office on January 20th, a mid-afternoon, will also be successful. I went through a transition on the front, and I've been on the other side of this. I'm very confident that we will do all the things that are necessary to make sure that the government, the United States government, will continue to perform its national security function as we go forward.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. The world is watching. They know the process. They have every assurance that the State Department will perform their role. And he says we, which could mean the State Department, but could mean the administration overall, will do everything necessary to make sure the U.S. government continues to perform its national security functions. He was very calm. He was very confident in his answer. And with the assumption that he's just not mindlessly boasting, I posed the question whether he was talking about in January of 2021 or perhaps January of 2025. CNN reported last week that Donald Trump's current team was not in consistent contact with the government agencies with whom that transition process could take place if the TV says Donald Trump is the winner of this fake election. It's like they don't even care at all. All of these executive branch bureaucracies and agencies have prepared memos for the incoming president and his transition team so that they have some level of cohesion, one program to the next, one administration to the next. Many of these people are career officials who implement the uniparty agenda on behalf of the global regime, no matter which president is in place. And a system of laws and rules and regulations has developed around that to empower those government agencies into eventually controlling everything and setting even the most minute policies for American government, American companies, and American individuals. Legitimately, the sort of government that we're told the founders hoped to avoid. I'm not so sure any longer that it was all of the founders. It was certainly the Anti-Federalists. And if you read the Anti-Federalist papers, you would see that the concerns they expressed indicate an awareness of exactly these sorts of problems arising at some point down the road. There were people who knew better, but they were largely ignored and they were steamrolled. And that was because certain people had different intentions. Spaces were created for infiltration. Loopholes were created for exploitation. They knew where this would go. We talked about Columbia Law School professor George P. Fletcher, a liberal professor, a globalist. He wrote a book called Our Secret Constitution, in which he argued that Abraham Lincoln fought the Civil War not to free the slaves, as our public schools teach us, but to supplant the Founders' Constitution with an inversion of that Constitution through the Reconstruction Amendments that expanded the federal government. In their wake, the Department of Justice was created to enforce the laws of that new government, to enforce the newfound understanding of civil rights under the 14th Amendment, and to make sure that no insurrectionists would ever rise again. Then the battle went to the courts and up to the Supreme Court, where the understanding of constitutional law was now flipped on its head. This is not me opining. This is Fletcher's argument, correctly framed and stated. He argued that the constitutional republic had been replaced by a democracy. He argued that the focus on the individual and individual rights would be replaced by the good of the state. And he argued that freedom and liberty would be replaced by equality. The book is called Our Secret Constitution for a reason. He was proud of the edifice that was constructed on top of the original Constitution and argued that it was a necessary reversal of the principles of the founding, because without it, racial equality would be impossible. We discussed the resolution in West Virginia, where the legislature has essentially declared that there is no way they will recognize Kamala Harris or another Democrat candidate as quote-unquote president if any one of a long series of conditions was met. And the truth is they're already all met to the extent that we're having a real election. We're not, but they were also all met in 2020. And it's the discovery of all of those conditions that has taken place over these last 4 years, a public understanding that this is how the elections are run. The West Virginia legislature's resolution is not only a warning against election fraud, it is a spotlight on the entire system. This is what the system is. It talks about ballot fraud and machine fraud, all manner of lawlessness in state elections. It talks about assassination attempts, media manipulations, and censorship. All the standards have already been met. All those lines have already been crossed. It would be enough if just one was, but they all were, and they were in 2020. That's a bold move by the state of West Virginia. They have essentially said the regime is not welcome here and we are willing to accept the consequences, assuming they will follow through. But that's a mirror of what happens whenever a country rejects the global regime. We talked about how they have 3 ways of keeping countries under their control. Media manipulation through the propaganda, the destruction of people's reputations. It doesn't even matter if claims are true. It only matters whether or not they can tell everyone and whether the target of the takedown is able or willing to defend himself or herself. That's as true of the average individual as it is of a president, of an organization, sometimes of a country. If the regime can't get what it wants through the use of words disseminated through their very free press, then it's economic manipulation, sanctions on countries, debanking, expensive lawfare, the devaluation of currencies. When you control the currency and you can create it out of thin air anytime you want, and with enough of it, you can buy basically anything. You can corrupt almost anyone. Well, then it's just a matter of the price. Economic warfare is waged against the civilians of nations. If the leaders won't relent and step down, economic warfare is used to ramp up the suffering of the people until they are willing to rebel against the leader who has been shamed and refuses to step down. This is true historically, and we've seen it happen to Donald Trump and his supporters. If people still don't give up when it's their time, then actual force is applied. People can be thrown in prison. Nations can be invaded by a UN peacekeeping mission, or NATO, or Team America World Police. But sooner or later, the regime will bring them all to heel. We talked about the International Crisis Group and their report from March 2020 on the crisis in Venezuela. The International Crisis Group is led by Lord Mark Malloch Brown. The CEO is Robert Malley, the fake administration's ambassador to Iran. The board of trustees is littered with current and former State Department officials, representatives of the military-industrial complex, and George Soros and his son Alexander. Their institutional partners are banks like HSBC, energy companies like BP and Chevron and Shell, huge globalist players. And the report is about how to overthrow the government in Venezuela and get Nicolas Maduro to step down. They note in the first line of the executive summary of that report that Venezuela had 2 presidencies. And we talked about what that means from the regime perspective. If it's not their guy in the role of real president, then they just simply decide someone else is the president and represent that person as president to the rest of the world. In Venezuela, they named the leader of the National Assembly Juan Guaido. That would have been like calling Nancy Pelosi the president throughout 2021 and 2022. And sure, she had a lot of international trips to conduct foreign policy on behalf of the illegitimate administration, but I'm sure that they weren't representing her as president or anything. That's Joe Biden, of course. You wouldn't want to get Nancy Pelosi in trouble for all of this nonsense. You use the fall guy, Joe Biden, who, by the way, seems like he might have a comeback. Not in the presidential race, per se. It's just starting to seem like the whole Biden family turned on the regime in revenge for making Biden the fall guy. But they recognized Guaido as the president of Venezuela, even though they admitted he doesn't have any actual power. They called him initially an interim president, and then 3 years later, he was still an interim president. And because nobody believed it, because governments in Europe and Latin America had already ceased recognizing Guaido as president, the United States just finally said, we're not going to recognize him as president anymore either. And just like that, the fake president was no longer fake president. It takes nothing to stand up a fake president, and it takes nothing to get rid of one. But what if you desperately needed to convince the world that the fake president was actually the real president? Well, then we would see the fake president doing all sorts of president-ish things. And we definitely saw at least a few of those. Now, he didn't live in the White House. We still haven't found out why. But he must be conducting business from there, even though we see them filming scenes across the street at the fake White House in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. And now we know there's another fake White House built to look exactly like the real one right down the street. What we have is a fake and illegitimate government layered on top of a real and legitimate government, to the extent that that is possible, considering no one anywhere has actually given their informed consent to either form at this point. But that's a problem for another day. Now, I know that all of this, despite being true, is just too hard to believe until an authoritative source says the same thing. If everything I just said was printed today in the New York Times, people would say, oh yeah, that's how it is. We've had 2 presidents for the last 4 years. One of them isn't actually president, though that's who we actually thought was president. Isn't that wild? It turns out that the guy we believed wasn't president, based on the other guy getting 81 million real lawful American votes, yeah, that guy's the guy that seems like he's really in charge. The perceptions are changing right now, but the reality is not changing. The reality has been the same the whole time. Is it crazier to believe something like this is possible, or is it crazier to know that they do this in Venezuela and for no supportable reason believe that they could never, ever do it here? It's the same people. It's the same interests. Members of the illegitimate Biden administration didn't even hide it. They would talk about the one world, liberal, international, rules-based order. The only way to do that is to have all the countries under control. They need the evil twin faction in each nation to be established and empowered and in control. It is a constant push and pull in every country. It has been that way for centuries. I would not be surprised if it has been that way for millennia. I have to assume people did not just begin wanting to control the entire world. We wrapped things up on Friday talking about how Friar Cuck, Jamie Raskin, the communist representative from Maryland, whose father was a prominent communist, having already suggested he would lead an effort to disqualify Donald Trump under the 14th Amendment once the new Congress is sworn in, 2 months after Donald Trump would have won the election. He also suggested that there would be efforts to object to the certification of electors on behalf of Donald Trump in the joint session of Congress on January 6th, 2025, arguing that it was necessary to do the exact thing they accused Donald Trump and his supporters of doing in 2021. It's quite clear they have a double standard on everything. I remember a quote from the pro-regime television host and former comedian Bill Maher, where he was discussing double standards between men and women. And he said, of course there's a double standard. It's because there's 2 sexes. We shouldn't need more examples that there are 2 systems of law, 2 systems of finance, 2 systems of morality. And we take this as a grave injustice that we need to work through the system to rectify. We pretend it's one system and it's just a little skewed. But it's legitimately two systems, the false one layered on top of the real one, creating the illusion that they're the same, but they're not. To paraphrase Bill Maher, of course there's a double standard. There's two governments. There's the sovereign constitutional republic, and then there's the bureaucratic rules-based order. It is global. It is international. And to that extent, it is a foreign entity. It is not of America. It is not American. To the extent that pieces of our country have been sold off physically, to the extent that the interests of our country have been sold off to global interests, that creates a stake in our nation for those foreign interests. At the point at which that stake becomes the majority share, the country itself ceases to be American. Should we pretend that didn't happen? Here's Donald Trump from Friday evening.
Now known as, and all throughout the world, as an occupied country. We're an occupied country, can you believe? And you know, they have a lot of people. If you think about it, 21 million, not including the gotaways. You know what a gotaway is? Those are the people that just run and nobody knows who the hell they are. But we have 21, think of this, 21 million people, 13,000 murderers, to be exact, 13,099 murderers, the biggest drug lords in the world. They got them all out of Caracas, Venezuela. Do you know that Venezuelan crime went down 72%? Because they put all their criminals into the good old USA. We're not going to stand for it. We're an occupied state that refuses to let our great law enforcement professionals do the job that they so dearly want to do. You know, the law enforcement wants to do the job. They really want to do the job, and they're not allowed to do the job. They want to do it so badly. They're so good, but they don't want to lose their pension. They don't want to be fired and lose everything, lose their family, lose their house. But to everyone here in Nevada and all across our nation, I make this vow to you. November 5th, 2024 will be Liberation Day in America. Liberation Day.
Now, he frames that in the context of illegal immigration. But is that really what he's talking about? Can you become an occupied country just from having let in millions of illegal aliens? That wouldn't really seem like the correct terminology there. Illegal aliens haven't taken over our government. They're not writing our laws. They're not the ones censoring us. They're not creating the propaganda. They're not waging war against us. They're not forcing us against our will to join medical experiments. They are not the occupying foreign entity, though there is one. We are occupied by representatives of the one world liberal international rules-based order. They don't even hide it. They say it right out front. They are involved in a global project. Now, if they wanted legitimacy, they could argue to the American people that actually the idea of America is now a mistake and we should actually want to be part of their global agenda. But they don't make that argument. They tell us they're the only ones who can protect us from climate change or protect us from very deadly pandemics. They tell us they're not giving our sovereignty over to global governing bodies like the United Nations and international courts and the World Health Organization. They tell us they don't intend to open up our borders. But they do tell us they're doing it all for us because that's the only way they can even maintain a semblance of the illusion of legitimacy. But of course, that too is a lie. They're working on behalf of the global regime. They are here, infiltrated into our government, creating the laws and rules and statutes and regulations by which we live and run our businesses. They are censoring us. They are waging war against us and in our name against other people like us in other nations around the world. They are forcing and coercing our participation in medical experiments against our will. They are poisoning our food and our water and our land. They're even trying to cut off children's genitals. These people are insane, and they are a foreign occupation. You have to think that's what he's talking about. So he says November 5th will be Liberation Day. And I hope he's right. I hope that is the day that the foreign occupation is officially, totally removed, and that the public understands it, and that accountability begins right after. Now, you can call me pessimistic. I think it's going to take a lot longer than that. I think it's going to take a lot more than that. regardless of whether or not the television tells us that Donald Trump won a fake election. These things are decided as the product of a negotiation that takes place at a much higher level. They have been trying to get Donald Trump and his supporters to back down for 9 years, and it hasn't happened. Sooner or later, they will be all out of tricks. They'll be all out of ammo. And the truth is, we have the option of ending it at any moment simply by understanding what it is and calling it out for its illegitimacy, calling it exactly what it is, understanding that that false government has no right to tell us what to do. It has no rights whatsoever. If it were legitimate, it would have authorities delegated to it by us, but it's not legitimate. And therefore, it has no authorities delegated to it by us. It is only a foreign occupying power, just like the same regime was right here 250 years ago. The fact that many of the people operating on behalf of the foreign occupying power were born in America, most of them, but not all, born to American parents, is separate from their status as operating on behalf of a foreign occupying entity. And of course, Trump has a name for these people. He calls them the enemies from within.
What are you expecting? Joe Biden said he doesn't think it's going to be a peaceful election day.
Well, he doesn't have any idea what's happening in all fairness. He spends most of his day sleeping. I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country. The towns, the villages, they're being inundated. But I don't think they're the problem in terms of election day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen.
How are you going to guard against the bureaucrats undermining you?
Well, they're going to undermine. Well, I always say, so we have two enemies. We have the outside enemy, and then we have the enemy from within. And the enemy from within, in my opinion, is more dangerous than China, Russia, and all these countries, because if you have a smart president, he can handle them pretty easily. I got along great with all of them. I handled them.
Just to be clear, that was two clips from his interview on Sunday Morning Futures with Maria Bartiromo, spliced together back to back. And immediately the discussion of the enemies from within became a major controversy. This is the Washington Post having a meltdown on Sunday afternoon, only a few hours after this interview was aired. Former President Donald Trump said in an interview that aired Sunday that he is worried about the prospect of unspecified actions by what he dubbed radical left lunatics on Election Day, urging that the National Guard or U.S. military be deployed on American soil against those he labeled the enemy from within. Now, I've been listening to the mainstream media cover Donald Trump for 9 years. During his first term, they would write article after article after article about how Donald Trump doesn't actually have the power as president to do the thing that he says he's going to do. And they were proven wrong about that over and over and over and over again. They loved to make Donald Trump sound like he didn't actually have the power. He didn't have the authority of his office. And again, constitutional legal strategies were deployed that would hold up in the courts, and they did hold up in the courts. But the goal was to make Trump sound weak and feckless. So I find it a little bit unusual that they're having such a meltdown over Donald Trump suggesting that the military or the National Guard might have to get involved on, quote unquote, Election Day to deal with radical left lunatics like the BLM Antifa domestic terrorists we saw in 2020. But are those the only radical left lunatics he's talking about? No, I don't think so. Regardless, why aren't they just telling us that Donald Trump doesn't have the power as a non-president to call out the military or the National Guard into duty on November 5th in order to protect the elections or to protect the American people from the chaos the foreign occupiers intend to cause on that day? It's almost like they're just accepting that he actually does have this power. But let's continue, because we know that's a conspiracy theory. The article recounts the conversation you just heard and then notes, When asked for additional clarification about what Trump meant in his interview, campaign spokesperson Stephen Chung equated the prospect of unspecified efforts by the left during the elections with the recent arrest of an Afghan man in Oklahoma who is accused of plotting an election day attack in the United States in the name of the Islamic State group. President Trump is 100% correct. Those who seek to undermine democracy by sowing chaos in our elections are a direct threat, just like the terrorist from Afghanistan that was arrested for plotting multiple attacks on Election Day within the United States, Chung said in a statement. The enemy from within, Trump argued in a later portion of the interview with Bartiromo, is more dangerous than China, Russia, and all these countries. He added that some politicians fell into that category. The thing that's tougher to handle are these lunatics that we have inside, like Adam Schiff, the former president added, referring to the California Democrat running for Senate. I call him the enemy from within, Trump said, repeating a term he used against the congressman on Saturday evening during a rally in Coachella, California. And that was an absolutely massive rally. Trump estimates the crowd at 100,000. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it was a big crowd. And I had to laugh at the 100,000 estimate because a festival very similar to the Coachella Music Festival was taking place on Saturday in Austin, Texas. It's called the Austin City Limits Festival. I've attended both. They're very, very similar events. The capacity for Austin City Limits is 75,000 people. So if Trump's numbers were even close to correct, he drew a bigger crowd in Coachella than all of those massive pop music superstars did for the festival in Austin. That's really something for a guy we're told is very unpopular, in fact, hated. CNN covered Trump's interview appearance in an article with the headline, Trump suggests using military against enemy from within on Election Day. The article features a video of a panel discussion about this issue for people who can't read and think on their own. Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign seized on Trump's comments, arguing they should, quote, alarm every American. Trump is suggesting that his fellow Americans are worse enemies than foreign adversaries, and he is saying he would use the military against them. Ian Sams, a senior spokesperson and advisor for the campaign, said in a statement Sunday, taken with his vow to be a dictator on day one, calls for termination of the Constitution, and plans to surround himself with sycophants who will give him unchecked, unprecedented power if he returns to office. This should alarm every American who cares about their freedom and security. And oh, I'm sure it does alarm every American. Each and every one of us is just absolutely beside ourselves, thinking that the dream of these people being held accountable could actually become a reality. It is absolutely alarming. To take just a slight tangent, Trump addressed Ian Sams on Truth Social yesterday, saying, how much time does Ian Sams, senior advisor to Lion Kamala Harris, spend on Fox News? He's now on Cavuto, Fox's lowest rated show by far, and spent much of the weekend hitting, quote unquote, Trump totally unopposed before two real, quote unquote, beauties, Eric Shawn and Arthel Neville, not exactly the next Walter Cronkite of the broadcasting world. Sams is just a below average guy with memorized fake news sound bites, almost all of which are wrong, but coupled with all of the other Harris radical left Democrat mouthpieces that Fox puts on, Richard Fowler, Patrick Murphy, Something Wolf, Jessica Tarloff, it has a very negative effect on the election. Think of it. I spend an hour with the wonderful Maria Bartiromo, do a beautiful job, and then am followed up all day long by one-sided negative Democrats, including Ian Sams, who virtually owns the network. It's not worthwhile doing interviews on Fox because it all just averages out into nothing. Fox News has totally lost its way. It kind of sounds like Donald Trump is demanding equal time. I did an episode on that back in June. It's called Equal Time. CNN's daily dose of Trump derangement, always written by Stephen Collinson, covered Kamabla's reaction to Trump's dangerous comments. The headline, Harris warns unhinged Trump is out for total power. Kamala Harris is responding to Democrat panic about her White House prospects by turning up the heat on Donald Trump. Oh, I bet he can barely stand it. The fake vice president warned Monday that the ex-president was unstable, unhinged, and out for quote-unquote unchecked power, as she sent a jolt of urgency through her campaign with 21 days to go. Watch his rallies. Listen to his words. He tells us who he is, and he tells us what he would do if he is elected president, Harris told a large crowd in Pennsylvania after a weekend when Trump's authoritarian rhetoric reached chilling new levels and hinted at the extreme nature of his potential second term. They have basically been repeating those lines for 9 years. Everything is chilling. It's authoritarian. It's scary. Everything Donald Trump is saying is scary. He's saying scary things. That's why we can never let him be president again, even if all of the people want him to be president specifically to punish us. We can't let him do it. And since the people won't help us, we're just going to have to rig another election on their behalf. Democrat vice presidential nominee Tim Walz, meanwhile, went even further, suggesting the ex-president's musings about the military against domestic foes he branded the enemy from within could even amount to treason. And that's a bold play from Twinkle Toes Timmy Walz. He's asserting that the fake government layered on top of the real government is actually the real government. The foreign occupation is actually all we've ever had, and it must be maintained even at the expense of the American people, their desires, their lives, their elections. Tim Walz isn't here to work on our behalf. He's here to work on behalf of the foreign occupation. He is here as a salesman to convince us that it's possible that he and Kamala could actually be the legitimate leaders of the United States of America. They don't need to win an election. Let's not be ridiculous. They just need to convince people that they could have possibly won a real election and then just mess with the incentive and punishment structure until everyone falls in line. Yes, they are running out of psyops. Yes, they're running out of the ability to create real kinetic events. But if people keep believing the television while those events become more and more obviously fictionalized, we will simply be stuck here. By the way, again, not to divert too far, but Tim Walz had a great moment in a speech yesterday.
Look, you all know it. We can't have 4 more years of this. We won't have 4 more years of it. We won't.
We can't have 4 more years of this. We won't? What does he mean? Isn't Kamala Harris, the fake vice president, second in command of the country right now? We can't have 4 more years of what? The people understanding and calling out the illegitimacy of their government? We can't have 4 more years where the power of the fake presidency, that illegitimate government, and the bureaucratic administrative state are in the process of systematically being reduced to nothing? We can't have 4 more years of the process of the foreign occupation being removed? That's exactly what we can have, Tim. There is a video, by the way, of Tim Walz at the end of his speech, imagining himself as the conductor of a great orchestra or maybe a prima ballerina, all while also being a football coach. It's almost like he's doing interpretive dance. And all of that is making much more sense recently. My friend Zach Payne, also known as Red Pill 78, did an interview with a man he vetted extensively, a foreign exchange student who says he was groomed by Tim Walz. There were then tweets by that black insurrectionist account claiming to have proof that Tim Walz was indeed a pedophile. That account is also the account responsible for disseminating the quote-unquote whistleblower affidavit from the employee of ABC News suggesting that Kamala Harris's campaign was given the questions in advance. Now, this is an interesting pair of claims because on some level, both of them seem to be essentially true. Of course, the campaign and the media organizations commonly exhibit levels of coordination. And I suggested in an episode a few weeks ago when we covered this that it actually doesn't matter if ABC News gives the questions to Kamala Harris. I think it's actually more likely that the Harris campaign gives the questions to ABC News. The truth is they're essentially partner organizations pursuing the same goal in the first place. Likewise, the black insurrectionist account's claims against Tim Walz could be entirely made up, even though there's compelling reason to believe that Tim Walz really is a groomer. And in that sort of circumstance, it really does seem like maybe that black insurrectionist account is creating these viral claims to undermine legitimate claims. Perhaps in the future we will see. Let's return to CNN and Kamala's reaction to Trump's comments. Harris and her team also aggressively questioned Trump's mental fitness and his capacity to serve another term, turning the tables on the Republican nominee, who for months leveled similar charges at President Joe Biden. And that part's true. Of course, it's because Joe Biden does not seem to have the mental fitness or capacity to serve. Donald Trump is flying around the country doing 2 rallies a day and DJing for impromptu dance parties. No one really knows what Joe Biden is doing, but apparently the Biden people and the Kamala people in the quote-unquote White House are at war. Trump told us that Biden hates Kamala. It sounds like it's mutual, and it sounds like it goes all the way through their individual support staffs. Skipping ahead. In a new section of her stump speech, Harris played a tape for her rowdy crowd in Erie featuring Trump's comment on Fox News' Sunday Morning Futures that he could turn the National Guard or regular military on the enemy from within. And it's worth noting that Collinson describes Harris's crowds at these events as large crowds, rowdy crowds, trying to make Harris sound extra popular. You heard his words, Harris said. He's talking about the enemy within Pennsylvania. He considers anyone who doesn't support him or who will not bend the knee to his will an enemy of our country. The vice president added Donald Trump is increasingly unstable and unhinged, and he is out for unchecked power. Now, none of that makes any sense, especially not after the last 4 years. It's amazing, isn't it? Trump says on behalf of the American people, we are going to hold these evil people, these members supporting this foreign occupation, we're going to hold them accountable. And those same members of the foreign occupation respond by trying to convince the people Trump is talking to that Trump is actually talking about them. I don't assume that all my fellow Americans support this foreign occupation. I'm as certain as can be Trump's not planning to come for me. I certainly can't say the same thing about Kamala. The foreign occupying power, to the extent it controls the censorship, which is a large extent, has already come after me. They tried to destroy my reputation in public in front of my friends, peers, and business associates. They destroyed my 15-year career. I don't see Donald Trump wanting to do that. I don't see a threat of Donald Trump doing that to me. Trump's not talking about going after the lives and livelihoods of American men and women. He's talking about holding accountable those who have participated in and supported this hostile foreign occupation. Just before Harris spoke, her running mate unveiled the Democrat ticket's most explicit assessment yet of Trump's potential threat to basic political freedoms if he wins a second term. Walz, the Minnesota governor, said the idea a president could use troops against Americans made him sick to my stomach. And the Army National Guard veteran highlighted a comment by the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, that Trump was a quote-unquote fascist to his core, which was reported in Bob Woodward's new book, War. So you have to trust Bob Woodward that that is what Mark Milley said, even though those words are out of context. And we would also have to trust Milley's opinion over our own. And also, of course, forget what fascist means. This is one of the big talking points of the week, though. Donald Trump is a fascist to his core. Let that sink in, Walz added. Don't be a damn bit afraid of saying it, because that's exactly who he is. That's exactly who he is. Okay, Tim. Well, I'm going to take your advice. I'm not going to apply it to Donald Trump. I'm going to apply it to you. And I will submit that you seem to be a flamboyant gay man to your core, and very likely a groomer. Jack Posobiec actually reported today, if you can call it that the members of Kamala's team refer to Tim Walz's wife, Gwen, as a Dollar Tree Hillary Clinton, which I find remarkable, not only for how disrespectful it is toward Tim Walz's beard, Gwen, but how even much more disrespectful it is to Hillary Clinton. Gwen Walz, the cheap version of something everyone already hates. It's weird to see Democrats admit that. Trump's former defense secretary, Mark Esper, who was replaced in that post-election period in 2020 with Christopher C. Miller, went on CNN to discuss all of this.
Secretary Esper, thank you for being here. When you hear what Trump is talking about, do you take those comments seriously?
Well, I think we should always take the comments of political leaders and other leaders seriously. Absolutely. He's spoken about this before. If you recall, a year ago or so, he spoke about a second Trump term being about retribution. So, yes, I think we should take those words seriously.
Well, I just think about what you wrote in your book, and that during the George Floyd marches and protests in 2020, he asked about shooting protesters. And as you wrote, you quoted him saying, "Can't you just shoot them in the legs or something?" And so when he's saying that the enemy from within should potentially be handled by the National Guard, and if necessary, the U.S. military, do you fear that he would try to utilize the National Guard, the military, against U.S. citizens?
Yes, I do, of course, because I lived through that. And I saw over the summer of 2020 where President Trump and those around him wanted to use the National Guard in various capacities in cities such as Chicago and Portland and Seattle. And of course, there was a moment in time, as you just described, where he, on that early date in June, where he wanted to bring in active duty military as well. So that's what equally concerns me about his comment would be the use of the military in these types of things. Now, the good news is I don't believe he has the authority under the law to use the military unless there was some type of civil disobedience or insurrection, in which case that would be used to the Insurrection Act. But otherwise, these other roles that he's described in the past are law enforcement, and that is prescribed under the Posse Comitatus Act, so he would not be able to use it. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but this would be a good discussion to have. But my sense is his inclination is to use the military in these situations, whereas my view is that that's a bad role for the military. It should only be law enforcement taking those actions.
So he doesn't think that Trump has the authority, not because Trump's not president, but because you can only deploy the military on American soil after having invoked the Insurrection Act. Now, it's worth noting that the entire thing is a bit absurd. The Posse Comitatus Act was put in place during that same Reconstruction period, the one where the federal government was changing shape, its powers were rapidly expanding. Now, there's a great argument that the federal government shouldn't have a standing army at all, and I think I would be on board with that. I think it would just be better if we had the state National Guards and they were fulfilling their intended purpose. But if we're going to have a federal level military force, rather than a collection of state National Guards that could be called into duty when necessary, they should at least be able to defend the country, particularly from foreign invasion. But we're told they're not allowed to operate on U.S. soil unless the Insurrection Act has been invoked. So did Trump invoke it? A lot of people think he did. Was there an insurrection against the United States of America during Donald Trump's first term? I'd say there were quite a few. Trump released a statement on January 6th asking the crowds to disperse, for people to go home, to respect the law and law enforcement. He cared about law and order. In the process of invoking the Insurrection Act, the president is required to issue a proclamation ordering insurgents to disperse and retire peacefully to their homes within a limited time. And if that doesn't happen, then the Attorney General and the Secretary of Defense can be directed to use any necessary assets to restore order. Is that what actually happened on January 6th, 2021? Is that what was covered up with the grand farce and charade that we now know as the very violent insurrection? The foreign occupying power was attempting to remove by force a duly elected legitimate president of the United States who was operating in a constitutionally legal and justifiable manner. So as with the West Virginia legislature, the terms of this have already been met. They were met 4 years ago. Should the president have to rely on a corrupted DOJ, a corrupted federal law enforcement branch, to put down an insurrection, to put down a usurpation of the American government by a foreign occupying power? What sense would that make? That would just mean that the foreign occupying power has been in power for so long that they have rewritten our laws in a way that makes it legal for them to take over forever and never give the country back. Why would anyone respect that sort of authority when no one has given informed consent to it? They may go along with the system out of habit. They may recognize the foreign occupying power as the government, but that's a result of an act of deception. That is an argument that can be made and can be won just based on a true and accurate recounting of the facts. But that's not all Trump plans to do with the National Guard. It's not all about Election Day. Here he is in Aurora, Colorado on Friday.
I'm announcing today that upon taking office, we will have an Operation Aurora at the federal level. To expedite the removals of these savage gangs, and I will invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Think of that. 1798. This was put there. 1798. That's a long time ago, right? To target and dismantle every migrant criminal network operating on American soil. Who would have ever thought that a president or a future president would ever have to stand here and say such things? Who would think that that's even possible to have to do? So many things are changed in the last 4 years, but that's the state of our country now after Kamala and Joe Biden have just absolutely destroyed our country. We're a country in tremendous distress. We're a failing country. We're laughed at all over the world. We will send elite squads of ICE, Border Patrol, and federal law enforcement officers to hunt down, arrest, and deport every last illegal alien gang member until there is not a single one left in this country. And if they come back into our country, they will be told it is an automatic 10-year sentence in jail with no possibility of parole. And I'm hereby calling for the death penalty for any migrant that kills an American citizen or a law enforcement officer.
So Donald Trump has announced Operation Aurora. This is the Associated Press on Friday. The headline: Trump drives his anti-immigration message in Aurora, Colorado. The Republican nominee has long promised to stage the largest deportation operation in U.S. history and has made immigration core to his political persona since launching his first campaign in 2015. In recent months, Trump has pinpointed specific smaller communities that have seen large arrivals of migrants, with tensions flaring locally over resources and some longtime residents expressing distrust about sudden demographic changes. Aurora entered the spotlight in August when a video circulated showing armed men walking through an apartment building housing Venezuelan migrants. Trump has claimed extensively that Venezuelan gangs are taking over buildings, even though authorities say that was a single block of the suburb near Denver and the area is again safe. Further on in the article, Trump often used dehumanizing language, referring to his political rivals as scum and to migrants as animals who have invaded and conquered Aurora. The town is infected by Venezuela, he said, and I'm sure that has a number of meanings. The foreign occupying power has infiltrated the same way here as it has in Venezuela. They have propped up a fake president here the same way they have in Venezuela. The gangs they once used to destabilize society in Venezuela have come here, and that example is what brought Donald Trump to Aurora in the first place. Talking about migrant rapists and murderers as animals is not offensive. Talking about politicians pretending to serve the American people while serving a foreign occupying power, scum, is not offensive. We have to clean out our country, Trump said, and he reprised the first controversy of his career in politics when he launched his 2016 campaign by saying migrants are rapists and bring drugs and crime. Well, hey, Kamala Harris said that about Christopher Columbus on the day after he became Jewish. Talk about dehumanizing language. That's even anti-Semitic. I took a lot of heat, but I was right, Trump said Friday, repeating the false claim that other countries are emptying their prisons and mental institutions and dumping their worst criminals in the United States. To thunderous applause, he called for the death penalty for any migrant that kills an American citizen or law enforcement officer. And we are supposed to, I guess, be upset about that. Later Friday in Reno, Nevada, Trump insisted that the U.S. is an occupied country and added, "I make this vow to you, November 5th, 2024 will be Liberation Day in America. Liberation Day." Trump announced in Colorado that as president, he'd launch Operation Aurora to focus on deporting members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, or TDA. The violent gang traces its origins more than a decade to an infamously lawless prison with hardened criminals. Trump also repeated his pledge to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, a 1798 law that allows the president to deport any non-citizen who is from a country that the U.S. is at war with. And I suppose under the good twin, evil twin paradigm, that would cover anyone. The evil twin faction exists in every country, and the human trafficking trade is bringing in criminals from all around the world on behalf of that foreign occupying power. It's worth remembering that Trump has called himself a wartime president, and in fact, Mike Johnson even called himself a wartime speaker. Global communist think tank The Brennan Center published an article about the Alien Enemies Act just last Wednesday. Thank goodness they got it up just in time. The Alien Enemies Act explained. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is a wartime authority that allows the president to detain or deport the natives and citizens of an enemy nation. The law permits the president to target these immigrants without a hearing and based only on their country of birth or citizenship. Although the law was enacted to prevent foreign espionage and sabotage in wartime, it can be and has been wielded against immigrants who have done nothing wrong, have evinced no signs of disloyalty, and are lawfully present in the United States. It is an overbroad authority that may violate constitutional rights in wartime and is subject to abuse in peacetime. So immediately you are to understand that even though the description sounds perfectly valid and like the sort of power a country who cares about its own sovereignty and security would retain, it's very, very evil because it could potentially hurt an innocent immigrant if it is applied incorrectly. You're not supposed to focus on whether or not it would be applied correctly. You're supposed to understand that because something bad could happen, we have to assume that something bad will happen on a massive scale and get rid of the entire law altogether. We should know that any invocation of this law is only for the purposes of evil. The Alien Enemies Act has been invoked 3 times, each time during a major conflict: the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. In World Wars I and II, the law was a key authority behind detentions, expulsions, and restrictions targeting German, Austro-Hungarian, Japanese, and Italian immigrants based solely on their ancestry. The law is best known for its role in Japanese internment, a shameful part of U.S. history for which Congress, presidents, and the courts have apologized. The president may invoke the Alien Enemies Act in times of, quote-unquote, declared war, or when a foreign government threatens or undertakes an invasion or predatory incursion against U.S. territory. The Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to declare war. So the president must wait for democratic debate and a congressional vote to invoke the Alien Enemies Act based on a declared war. But the president need not wait for Congress to invoke the law based on a threatened or ongoing invasion or predatory incursion. The president has inherent authority to repel these kinds of sudden attacks, an authority that necessarily implies the discretion to decide when an invasion or predatory incursion is underway. And of course, President Trump announced that to the nation from the press briefing room of the White House during COVID. He said he's a wartime president. He has declared invasions. He has declared a foreign occupying power. Any proper future adjudication of this issue on constitutional grounds would find in Trump's favor. He has completed all the necessary steps, but we are to pretend that hasn't happened, just as we are to pretend that our country is not already subject to a multi-dimensional, multi-domain, fifth-generational world war. The Brennan Center asks, do the terms invasion or predatory incursion have to be taken literally, or could the president proclaim a rhetorical invasion? As the Supreme Court and past presidents have acknowledged, the Alien Enemies Act is a wartime authority enacted and implemented under the war power. When the Fifth Congress passed the law and the Wilson administration defended it in court during World War I, they did so on the understanding that non-citizens with connections to a foreign belligerent could be, quote, treated as prisoners of war, end quote, under the, quote, rules of war, under the law of nations, end quote. In the Constitution and other late 1700s statutes, the term invasion is used literally, typically to refer to large-scale attacks. The term predatory incursion is also used literally in writings of that period to refer to slightly smaller attacks like the 1781 raid on Richmond led by American defector Benedict Arnold. So an American led a predatory incursion against the country. Trump has expressed many times the size and scale of the invasion, so it seems those standards have been met. He has again declared he was a wartime president, so those standards have been met. And if he's claiming that we are an occupied nation, if there is a foreign occupying power and people are working on behalf of that power, and many people have passports from those foreign belligerent nations, you would think they would have to qualify. You have to wonder if maybe this has something to do with why these people are always panicking and talking about fleeing the country. Let's continue. Today, some anti-immigration politicians and groups urge a non-literal reading of invasion and predatory incursion so that the Alien Enemies Act can be invoked in response to unlawful migration and cross-border narcotics trafficking. These politicians and groups view the Alien Enemies Act as a turbocharged deportation authority, but their proposed reading of the law is at odds with centuries of legislative, presidential, and judicial practice, all of which confirm that the Alien Enemies Act is a wartime authority. Invoking it in peacetime to bypass conventional immigration law would be a staggering abuse. This according to the global communist think tank, the Brennan Center. They are basically reliant here only on precedent. Although the Alien Enemies Act has only been invoked in major conflicts, Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Harry Truman continued using the law after the cessation of hostilities in World War I and II. World War I ended in 1918, but the Wilson administration used the law to intern German and Austro-Hungarian immigrants until 1920. That's weird, isn't it? We put Germans in concentration camps? And World War II ended in 1945, but the Truman administration used the law for internments and deportations until 1951. In its 1948 Ludicky versus Watkins opinion, a narrow majority on the Supreme Court upheld the Truman administration's extended reliance on the Alien Enemies Act, reasoning that it was not the judiciary's place to second-guess the president on a matter as, quote-unquote, political as when a war terminates and wartime authorities expire. And you see, that narrow majority means they were almost wrong. The Supreme Court decided against the viewpoint of this author, but almost decided to agree. She goes on. The courts should strike down any attempted peacetime use of the Alien Enemies Act, but the political question doctrine may prevent them from doing so. This doctrine cautions the courts against addressing issues that fall within Congress and the president's constitutional duties and that lack judicially manageable standards for resolution. The courts have used the political question doctrine to avoid resolving claims that touch on matters of war and peace, as well as other sensitive foreign policy matters. In the 1990s, they relied on the doctrine to dismiss claims that the Clinton administration was permitting a migration invasion in violation of Article 4 of the Constitution. And I'm fairly certain the author is referring to Section 4 of Article 4, known as the Guarantee Clause, which requires the federal government to ensure that each state maintains a Republican form of government. It also obligates the federal government to protect states against invasion and, upon request, against domestic violence. So people aligned with the Brennan Center ideology would have been very happy about the court's interpretation of the political questions doctrine in that matter, but now they're worried that the court might follow that same precedent when it comes to what Donald Trump might do. There's a double standard because there are two governments, the government of the constitutional republic and the illegitimate and unaccountable bureaucratic state of the foreign occupying power. Back to the article. And in other cases, the courts have held that the president's recognition of a foreign government is binding on the judiciary. Basically, they are not allowed to tell the president what does or does not constitute a hostile foreign actor, or a war, or an invasion, or a predatory incursion. Back to the article. If the courts were to deploy the same reasoning here, it could allow the president to invoke the Alien Enemies Act based on a migrant invasion or predatory incursion perpetrated by a cartel alleged to be acting as a de facto foreign government. A cartel. Like organized crime, like a criminal enterprise. So the focus here would be on a foreign criminal enterprise that is at war with the country, that has invaded the country, that is staging a predatory incursion against the country. Is there an entity like that? Yes, it's the foreign occupying power. They are operating as a de facto foreign government. According to the Supreme Court's 1962 Baker v. Carr opinion, which formalized the political question doctrine, the courts can wade into the political thicket to correct, quote, an obvious mistake or, quote, manifestly unauthorized exercise of power. The courts have never relied on this backstop, however, and there is little clarity regarding when or how it could be applied. But even if the courts refuse to second-guess whether there has been an invasion or predatory incursion by a foreign government, they would still be able to consider constitutional and other purely legal challenges to the president's authority. As the Brennan Center explains in its report on the Alien Enemies Act, the law raises serious concerns under the Constitution's guarantees of equal protection and due process. And of course, right there, they're referring to the Reconstruction Amendments, specifically the 14th. This is a perfect example of what we were discussing before, of what George P. Fletcher wrote about in the book, Our Secret Constitution. They believe that the 14th Amendment would force the courts to ignore this law completely because the law raises serious questions under the guarantees of equal protection and due process. Although not the focus of our research, the law also raises concerns under U.S. laws implementing the 1967 Refugee Protocol and Convention Against Torture, as well as under constitutional separation of powers theories that limit the authority Congress can delegate to the president. The courts could strike down or limit the Alien Enemies Act on any of these grounds. They are instructing you on how their system removes systematically the Constitution and everything designed to protect the United States of America against exactly this sort of system. Congress, too, could repeal the Alien Enemies Act to prevent or stop abuse. Representative Ilhan Omar and Senator Mazie Hirono have already introduced a repeal bill, the Neighbors Not Enemies Act, in the House and Senate. And I wonder if Ilhan Omar and Mazie Hirono wrote that legislation themselves. How did they come up with that? Just one day they said, oh man, that Alien Enemies Act of 1798, that sure seems unjust. We should get rid of that. In the announcement of that legislation on Mazie Hirono's website, there are quotes from David Inoue, the executive director of the Japanese American Citizens League, and Vanita Gupta, president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The press release is followed by a long list of leftist, social justice, civil rights organizations, funded, of course, by global philanthropists. I would estimate there are about 30 of them here. We don't need to go through all of them, but Black Alliance for Just Immigration, the Minnesota Peace Project, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, the International Refugee Assistance Project, Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, Reviving the Islamic Sisterhood for Empowerment, the National Immigration Law Center, and it just goes on and on. So who wrote this legislation? I would guess it was all of these organizations at the behest of the global philanthropists who fund them. Now, I have no doubt that some of that is preserving the slave trade, preserving the open borders. They've spent untold time and resources bringing millions and millions of impoverished foreigners and criminals into this country. They wouldn't want to see that reversed. Should we pretend that Ilhan Omar and Ed Markey and Mazie Hirono are doing any of this for the American people? Of course they're not. They're operating on behalf of the foreign occupying power. And I'll just go through one of these quotes. This is Senator Markey. It is long past time we repeal the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a law that Donald Trump has channeled as justification for his racist Muslim ban. Until this wrong-headed law is repealed, it will remain ripe for exploitation by others who seek to advance their own racist and xenophobic beliefs. We must learn from our past in order to create a more humane and just immigration future. I am proud to co-sponsor the Neighbors Not Enemies Act and to begin to right these past wrongs. This isn't the first time that Donald Trump has suggested using the Alien Enemies Act. This is from NBC on September 20th of 2023. The article quotes Trump saying, "I'll invoke immediately the Alien Enemies Act to remove all known or suspected gang members, the drug dealers, the cartel members, from the United States, ending the scourge of illegal alien gang violence once and for all." Trump put forward his proposal in a speech intended to outline what would amount to his second-term immigration policy, one that foreshadows a greater use of executive branch powers and law enforcement resources, which the president could have a greater hand in directing. He also told the crowd that he would reinstate and expand the travel ban that he implemented during his first term in the White House. The ban, which President Joe Biden ended on his first day in office, barred most individuals from 7 countries, including 5 Muslim-majority countries, from entering the United States. The law says a president may order non-citizens to be apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed as alien enemies when he makes a public proclamation that an invasion or predatory incursion is perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation. And again, we're talking about a foreign occupying power that has already invaded, already infiltrated, already usurped the American government. One last thing from the Brennan Center article. The Alien Enemies Act discriminates against immigrants based on their country of citizenship and more broadly based on their ancestry. The breadth of the law's discrimination is apparent on the face of the law and from its history. By its text, the Alien Enemies Act covers not only citizens of a foreign belligerent, but also the quote-unquote natives, or individuals who were born in the enemy state but renounced their citizenship and no longer owe allegiance to that state. The law's application to quote-unquote natives clarifies the law's focus on birth heritage and its conflation of ancestry with disloyalty in wartime. In the decades following World War II, when Congress and the executive branch apologized for Japanese, German, and Italian internment, they recognized that immigrants had been targeted, regulated, and interned under the Alien Enemies Act based on their ancestry. Now, apart from those issues, let's just spend a second considering how interesting it is that Donald Trump is naming operations. This is going to be Operation Aurora. It's strange, isn't it, that he's naming these operations without actually being president? I mean, he's not president, right? He's not commander-in-chief of the constitutional republic. Joe Biden has that role. Joe Biden's commanding the military, isn't he? Or at least he was. He was going to run for fake president again until they simply told him, no, you can't do that. It wasn't under any act of law. It wasn't because he was disqualified. There was nothing constitutional about that process. The private corporation known as the Democrat National Committee simply swapped him out on behalf of the Uniparty, on behalf of the global regime, on behalf of the foreign occupying power. The foreign occupying power, you see, makes whatever rules it wants when it comes to elections. The elections, of course, are theirs. It's their government, not ours. The laws aren't enforced on them. The laws exist specifically to protect them, to protect their system, to protect their foreign occupation. There's a double standard because there are 2 governments. One of them is the constitutional republic, and the other is the bureaucratic administrative state of the foreign occupying power. They swapped Biden out, and now they're stuck with Kamala Harris. Or are they? People say it's too late to replace Kamala Harris. Is it? Why? They're not constrained by morality. They're not constrained by ethics. They're not constrained by the law. They write the law. You might say they're constrained by time. The election is 3 weeks from today. But then you have to remember it's a fake election. And they can just reschedule it. Or they could cancel it and hold another one later. Or they could go through with it and simply delegitimize it and then declare that a new election is necessary. If they don't end up replacing Kamala, it won't be because they were restricted by the law or restricted by any principles. It will just be because they determined it was going to be too difficult to sell that new option to the people. No one would believe it. There would be no way to create the illusion of legitimacy that would be necessary. Americans would be even more inclined to remove these people from power and more likely to understand them as a hostile foreign occupation. Trump advisor and the director of America First Legal, Stephen Miller, wrote on X, formerly Twitter, lots of D.C. gossip that Democrats are trying to replace Kamala. This would explain the aggressive counter-programming from Biden and Clinton. Explosive new plagiarism scandal adds even more pressure for a change at top of ticket. And the plagiarism scandal seems like an obvious op being run by former DeSantis simp Chris Rufo, who's one of our strongest anti-woke warriors. The whole operation seems like it's basically the Twitter files, a sequel to when he discovered that the president of Harvard was also a plagiarist. Kamala Harris's book apparently contains a number of examples of copy and paste rather than actual writing by Kamala Harris. But of course, if you believe that Kamala Harris wrote the book in the first place, you already don't understand how things work. This is a pretty silly controversy. Kamala Harris would be better off just saying a ghostwriter did that. But then, of course, you call the entire publishing industry into question. That might cause people to wonder if a guy like Bob Woodward isn't necessarily telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And that would be hard to imagine from the guy who helped the CIA take down Richard Nixon. Stephen Miller was responding to Jason Miller, who joked about the Democrats dropping Kamala to substitute in crooked Hillary. And that's funny because Donald Trump just suggested the same thing.
I have to run against a guy. I spent $150 million. I had to debate him. I debated the guy. He went way, way down. And I thought it was over. And then it's like a fighter. Then they put a new person in her. And we don't know anything about her. But now we learned, and now the people are learning, and she's crashing like a rock. Uh-oh. I just a thought from a very brilliant mind, they might want to put a third person in that. Oh, no. Please be nice to Kamala, to my people, I'm telling you. Everybody that's on the Trump team, be nice to Kamala, because they're going to put a third person in. Let's see, who are they going to put in next? This can only happen. They keep saying Hillary. Hillary's coming. Oh, Hillary's back. You know, it's interesting. If Trump talks about the 2020 election, they say, indict him. He's a conspiracy theorist. But Hillary's still talking about 2016. She has got serious Trump derangement syndrome. She's got a massive case of Trump derangement. No, but you ever notice she talks about it all the time, all those people that. But when anybody from the right talks even a little bit, no, we don't forget. We're not forgetting.
And why would we forget? We still have Rico Grande out there. I've talked about this on Badlands. I'm not sure if I've talked about it on this podcast, but if you think about the timeline of the last 8 or 9 years, the Trump era, you can start with the 2015 primary and the beginning of that campaign. But let's just focus in on 2016. 2016 through January 20th, 2021, the first Trump campaign and the first Trump term. Think about that going left to right. And then you've got January 20th, 2021 to now. Take that January 20th, 2021 mark and fold that timeline back over itself. And that's essentially the story structure of this long-running narrative. The hero needs to return all the way back to that inciting incident and rectify the situation that sparked all this chaos in the first place. Hillary may not come back as a candidate, but she has to come back as a story. That storyline is not over yet, just like the Obama storyline is not over yet. It's a matter of the circumstances under which those stories will play out, because they will play out. And it's going to take longer than the next 3 weeks, which is why we have to be prepared to maintain this same sort of focus for a longer period. Trump has talked a number of times now about a great 250th birthday celebration for America beginning in May 2025 and running until Independence Day, July 4th of 2026. Although who knows, maybe we'll have to extend it all the way through Liberation Day. But I have a feeling Trump mentioned that date, that May 2025 date, for a reason. Perhaps the process will take that long. Maybe we'll have to witness the country being run by no president at all, in a way even clearer than it is now. Because, of course, right now, people are unwilling to recognize it. They are begging for the hose again. They don't want to accept the truth, so they're going to have to get smacked in the face with it one more time, or maybe 10 more times. Hillary Clinton is a prominent member of that foreign occupying power, part of the criminal enterprise working on their behalf. She's got to come back into the story. Stephen Miller mentioned how Barack Obama and Bill Clinton had been out there ostensibly in support of Kamala Harris, but figuring out ways to undermine her regardless. We discussed the clip yesterday, Bill Clinton talking about how if the illegal aliens had been properly vetted at the border, people like Laken Riley might still be alive. Now, maybe he's just an old fool, but he certainly didn't do Kamala Harris any favors. He was out there again today. He got asked what he thinks will happen in this election. Here's what he says.
What do you think this election comes down to? What's that?
Who wants it bad enough?
Yeah.
And whether we can get an honest, open count.
Now, I know that was a bit hard to hear over the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Higher Ground, a song about, interestingly, reincarnation. Clinton was asked, what do you think the election comes down to? He says, who wants it bad enough and whether we can get an honest, open count. Now, those are two interesting answers in the framework of what we've discussed today. Who wants it bad enough? Donald Trump on behalf of the American people, and the American people willing to continue to support Trump no matter what may come, or the foreign occupying power? There is nothing they won't do, so it's really just a matter of whether or not Trump and his supporters can withstand that. Do the American people actually want it bad enough? Do they want to remove the foreign occupying power or not? That is what the election comes down to. As for the honest, open count, I can't imagine Bill Clinton actually believes there would be an honest, open count. Bill Clinton was responsible for Motor Voter, the program that has the DMV registering all of these illegal aliens for the last 30 years. He signed the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 with, by the way, unipartisan support. But Bill Clinton doesn't care about an open and honest count. He cares about the illusion of an open and honest count. Bill Clinton, a man who has cheated in every aspect of his life, is essentially asserting that Trump will only win if he cheats. This is the editorial board of the New York Times on Saturday. This election will need more heroes. True political courage, the principle to stand, the elevation of country over party pressure, the willingness to sacrifice a career to protect the common good, has become painfully rare in a polarized world. Although you could ascribe all of those characteristics to Donald Trump. But we'll just pretend to agree that it's very rare in our polarized society. It deserves to be celebrated and nurtured whenever it appears, especially in defense of fundamental American institutions like our election system. The sad truth, too, is the country will probably need a lot more of it in the coming months. Imagine framing it as an act of courage to defend fundamental American institutions like our election system. If that was their priority, why do they keep passing election laws that intentionally make the process less secure and more open to manipulation? In state after state, Republicans have systematically made it harder for citizens to vote and harder for the election workers who count those votes to do so. They are challenging thousands of voter registrations in Democrat areas, forcing administrators to manually restore perfectly legitimate voters to the rolls. Gosh, those poor administrators. They are aggressively threatening election officials who defended the 2020 election against manipulation. And guess what they cite as proof of that? A story by Fake News CBS on how Stephen Richer, the Maricopa County recorder in the post-2020 election period, is receiving what they call violent threats. And here's how they describe those threats. Richer faced threats after he spoke out and defended the county's results. After a meeting in 2021, Richer says he was heckled and followed to his car. 3 violent threats to Richer have been prosecuted. Frederick Francis Goltz, who pleaded guilty to a charge of interstate threatening communications, was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. The others are awaiting trial. The threats didn't stop after 2020. Just months ago, Richer was booed when he said he didn't believe the 2020 election was stolen. Now, certainly, threats of violence are totally inappropriate, but booing someone and heckling them after a meeting are not violent threats. These are public servants, and if they are not serving the public and are instead working at the behest of a foreign occupying power, people aren't going to be happy with that. Let's go back to the New York Times. They are trying to invalidate mail-in ballots that arrive after Election Day, even if they meet the legal requirements of a postmark before the deadline. They are making it more difficult to certify election results and even trying to change how states apportion their electors in hopes of making it easier for Donald Trump to win or even help him overturn an election loss. And of course, all of these things are examples of actions the Uniparty has taken itself. They're putting these measures in place to enhance their ability to dictate the outcomes of elections, or perhaps more accurately, to substantiate the election results they report. We have the tendency to get these things slightly out of order when considering stolen elections. The real votes and the fake votes substantiate the result that's reported. The fake votes would hardly be necessary if no one actually ever wanted to check. That's why they don't let people check, and that's why when people do check, they often don't have the votes. Let's continue. Though many of these moves happened behind closed doors, this campaign is hardly secret. And last month, Mr. Trump directly threatened to prosecute and imprison election officials around the country who disagree with his lies. Well, no, that's not what he did. He threatened to prosecute and imprison people who were stealing elections. But of course, the elections are fake, and the regime knows they're fake. That's why they force people to attest to the fact that the elections are real and that they will accept the results no matter what the results are, no matter how the election is run. No matter the level of criminality, the results have to be accepted. Because if you don't accept the results, people are going to begin looking at the elections. Then they'll find out that the elections are fake. And then rather than supporting one side of the Uniparty or the other, they will understand the Uniparty as that foreign occupying power and act to remove them and stop complying with their demands and stop participating in their system. But we're not there yet. People want to get the hose again. Maybe that'll change within the next 3 weeks, but it doesn't seem to be the plan. Against this kind of systematic assault on the institutions and processes that undergird American democracy, the single most important backstop are the public servants, elected and volunteer, who continue to do their jobs. That's weird because all of these outlets wrote hit pieces about the various groups around the country, encouraging Republicans out there to get involved in their elections. They don't like it when Trump supporters do it. They only like when supporters of the Uniparty, on behalf of the foreign occupying power, do it. There's a double standard because there's two governments. The article continues with a bunch of examples. They're backing up their story. They're repeating the central narrative. They're getting all the slogans out there. They want their readers to know there's some real meat on the bones with each one of their claims. But let's skip ahead toward the end. It's important for voters to reject these conspiracy theorists in November. But the greatest responsibility lies with those who hold the greatest power. That means top Republicans, some of whom have put their careers on the line to protect the country against Mr. Trump and the MAGA movement, and who have since spoken out in support of the rule of law and the Constitution. Rusty Bowers, the former Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, who refused to go along with the Trump team's groundless claims of election fraud. Mike Pence, the former Vice President, who in the face of threats to his life by January 6th rioters, did his constitutionally mandated job, and has now declined to endorse his former boss. Liz Cheney, who was a top-ranking House Republican until she helped lead the investigation of the January 6th riot, and Mitt Romney, the Utah senator who voted to convict Mr. Trump following his second impeachment for inciting insurrection. These people, according to the New York Times, are the heroes that we need. Defying Mr. Trump and MAGA's efforts to undermine the result of a free and fair election often came at great cost to these people, to their relationships, and at times to their own and their families' physical safety. For this, they deserve our praise and gratitude. And I love how they just smuggle that claim in that these people were actually threatened with their physical safety beyond words on the internet. You really do have to wonder what these quote-unquote public servants think should happen when they are openly and willfully defying the will and consent of the people they ostensibly represent. No one's even supposed to say an angry word. Again, actual threats of violence are totally inappropriate, but saying online that someone should be imprisoned for committing a crime or tried for treason if they've committed treason, those aren't death threats. Those aren't threats of violence. Those are assertions that criminals should be held accountable under the rule of law. And they do this all the time to MAGA and to Donald Trump, who has faced more threats than Donald Trump, who's faced more violent acts than Donald Trump. But it doesn't matter. It's a double standard. There's a double standard because there are two governments. You don't get to enjoy the benefits of their system if you're trying to take down their system. Back to the New York Times. Yet far too few of these heroes will still be in office as the 2024 elections take place. Others will need to step up over the coming weeks and months. Poll workers, state officials, and Republican members of Congress may well be pressured to cast doubt on or even work to undermine election results that don't go Mr. Trump's way. If the recent past is any guide, they may be called on to block prospective voters from the polls, to question ballots from Democrat precincts, to refuse to certify valid election results, and even to engage in election fraud by posing as presidential electors. And think about what they're asserting here. These are all things that shouldn't happen. And if they don't happen, then consider the principles being asserted here. They should allow any voter to vote because you can't block anyone from the polls, even non-citizens. Every ballot should be considered valid, even if the signatures don't match at all, even if the ballots were marked by a machine rather than a pen. Maybe that's why California is allowing people to print them out at home now. It's called remote accessible vote by mail. They passed it initially for the disabled and for military members overseas, but now everyone can do it. The editorial board at the Times apparently believes that whoever is tasked with certifying election results must act simply as a rubber stamp. They have no ability to actually scrutinize the results they are handed, and there cannot be alternate slates of electors no matter what, which is weird because JFK submitted an alternate slate of electors from Hawaii when he defeated Richard Nixon. That was okay back then, but not okay now because of, reasons. But consider the principles here. They don't care about achieving proper election results that are verifiable and transparent and accepted by the people. They care about making sure that the results produced by their system cannot be challenged, because through challenging the results, the illusion of legitimacy disappears. That's why they had to create all that chaos in the post-election period of 2020 and into 2021. That's why they needed the very violent insurrection to disrupt the proceedings so that the American public wouldn't see the evidence presented that elections are fake all across the country. The Times wraps things up this way. The danger to the future of American democracy is profound and will not go away on its own. The rule of law only survives thanks to the actions of regular, honest people choosing to uphold it in large and small ways every day. And they're right about that. They're just wrong about what it means and who's actually doing it. Amazing, isn't it? That the regime, the uniparty, the foreign occupying power in this country needs heroes to protect the election system that they designed and they control, even with the rest of their tools, the propaganda media, their control over finance and economies and currencies, and their ability to make use of state violence, whether that's on behalf of various organizations inside the United States or more overtly through global governing bodies like a UN peacekeeping mission. They control the voter registries. They control the printing of ballots, the sending of ballots, the collection of ballots, the marking of ballots, the counting of ballots, the lawfare apparatus that protects the fake elections, and much of the judicial system that adjudicates any concerns. But still, they need heroes, because without these heroes, the people might realize that their country is controlled by a foreign occupying power, and they might want to do something about it. They might want to follow through with these threats that are framed around targeting the illegal alien invasion, but could be applied to virtually anyone operating on behalf of the foreign occupying power. They talk regularly about fleeing the country. That's the sort of thing that members of a foreign occupying power might do. But if that's not who and what they are, why are they so scared? This is from the Daily Mail today. Inside the secret prepping to get federal death row ready for a Trump presidency. The Justice Department is prepping the federal government's death row for a resumption of executions in the event Donald Trump wins the election. It is understood a visit was made last week by officials to inspect the so-called death range at Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana, where the 40 prisoners serving federal death sentences are held. No executions have been carried out by the U.S. government during Joe Biden's term, but Trump has indicated that lethal injections will quickly resume if he retakes the White House. At the end of his first term, 13 inmates at Terre Haute were put to death in 6 months, the biggest surge of federal executions since World War II. The article goes into some personal backstories of individuals on death row, so let's skip ahead. Between 2003 and 2020, no federal executions were carried out, but they resumed toward the end of Trump's first term. When Biden took over in January 2021, he was the first president to be openly against capital punishment. He introduced a moratorium and carried out no executions. Anti-death penalty campaigners say they anticipate the largest federal civilian execution spree in U.S. history if Trump is reelected, unless Biden commutes some or all death sentences. By the way, this subject is cause for a long-term regime freakout. There have been a series of articles over the years about Donald Trump bringing back federal executions. I did an episode about this on February 15th of 2023, and I remember that being a fun one, so check that out if you haven't heard it before. But there seems to be a lot of panic going around about what Donald Trump is going to do in his second term, which is strange for such a close election with such a vibrant, popular, joy-based, vibes-based campaign and candidate in Kamala Harris. Trump's plans are pretty well laid out. He's talking about the military and the National Guard protecting our election in 3 weeks, but we're told he has no authority to deploy them in any way. We're hearing about laws he's going to put into use that can only be used after an invocation of the Insurrection Act. But we're told that never happened, even though Trump met the standards for that as well. He just didn't tell us about it. Or maybe the television didn't tell us. He certainly said before that the real insurrection was on November 3rd, 2020. We're told these laws can only be used under wartime or an invasion or a predatory incursion. But we have all of those, and Trump has announced those too. He's out there naming federal law enforcement operations. That's awfully strange for a presidential candidate, isn't it? And preparations are being made for an extraordinary spike in the number of federal executions. The people who say this is unlawful and unjust and violent and scary are the same people who weaponized the totality of the federal government in collusion with every institutional power of this country against the American people, which seems like a pretty stunning hypocrisy. It seems like a double standard. But as far as they're concerned, that's appropriate because there are two governments. All right, so tomorrow's live stream will be at 6 p.m. Eastern. I will send the link to that live stream around in a Substack post. Please leave your comments, your questions in the replies to that post, any articles you would like to go through, and I'll try to get through as much of that as I can. If you want to get the link to that live stream, become a paid subscriber at imyourmoderator.substack.com. As for this podcast, I will be back on Thursday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon down on the range.